passage is nowhere recorded anywhere in the pages of Scripture so far as the life and ministry of Jesus is concerned, and but it was yet well known among all the brethren, even those in Ephesus, where that statement was made in Acts chapter 20, and of course that was a long ways away from what we would commonly refer to as the Holy Land. But I want us to think about some things as we close out this particular lesson. Looking at giving is a privilege. Jeremiah, will you do me a favor? Will you go cut the water on in that baptistry so we can get it at least filled up above the return? I'm tired of hearing that thing gurgling.
Well, it's like out of water, and I thought, well, I'm just here.
At the water level, it evaporates, and when it gets down below the return, it creates a suction there and makes that noise. If we can get the water up about 2 inches, now you have to hear water running, but at least it won't sound like somebody gargling. So, but looking at giving is a privilege. Again, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And in the opening paragraph, in the third line, says, the more selfishly and obsessively one seeks happiness, the more it eludes him. In other words, happiness is not something to be pursued. It's not something to be chased, or to diligently follow after. But yet Paul spoke in Philippians, for example, in Philippians chapter 4, said, "I've learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content." And to be content would of necessity, I think, entails some degree of happiness. But those that are constantly pursuing something to make them happy will always find that happiness is short-lived. In other words, if they think that owning a certain type of vehicle will make them happy, well, we all know that most vehicles are only 7 years from the junkyard, as a general rule. And around here, probably less than that, because you're probably going to hit a deer. And so, but if we think a vehicle is going to make us happy, then that happiness is going to be short-lived. Or if we think money is going to make us happy, or a certain type of living standard is going to make us happy, then we're going to find that generally speaking, we're not going to enjoy the kind of life that God wants us to have. I was looking at thinking about this passage. I may have referenced it, but I couldn't find where I had it written anywhere. In Proverbs chapter 30. In Proverbs chapter 30, and in verse number 15 and 16. Proverbs 30, verses 15 and 16. The text says, "The leech has 2 daughters, give and give." Now, we know what a leech is, right? We know what a leech is. It says, "The leech has 2 daughters, give and give." It says, "There are 3 things that are never satisfied, 4 never say enough: the grave, the barren womb, the earth that is not satisfied with water, and the fire never says enough." In other words, the fire is never satisfied with the fuel that it's burning. It'll always take more. The earth, until it becomes completely saturated, always will take more water. But in the personal aspect of it, the barren womb. In other words, there are a number of accounts in our Bibles about barrenness and the difficulties that such created in the lives of those in Bible times. And so, but what the text is saying is the barren womb is never satisfied because it is barren. And so I was just thinking about those particular texts. But again, the general tenor of that text is that if you are always looking for something to make you happy, you will continue to always look for something to make you happy. And that's the tenor of the idea there. Then in the next paragraph, it says, the Bible is filled with tragic stories of shallow men and women who lived only for themselves. And by the way, many of these, if you recall, their lives ended in tragedy, or ended in a tragic fashion. For example, it said Ahab killed Nabal. Now Ahab was the king of Israel. He had basically had anything that he wanted so far as money and whatnot was concerned. But out his window he could see the vineyard of Naboth. And it was a good vineyard, and he wanted Naboth to sell him that vineyard. And Naboth wouldn't do it because it was against Jewish custom and law for him to sell his inheritance. And then, of course, Ahab pitched him a fit and sold up and wouldn't eat and went and pitched a fit in his bedroom. And then his wife, and she was a fine one, if you recall, her name was Jezebel. And she mocked him for acting like a child. And she conjured up a way for Naboth, or for Ahab, to get Naboth's vineyard. She raised up some false witnesses to say that Naboth had blasphemed the Lord. And based on the testimony of those false witnesses, they killed Naboth, put him to death, and Jezebel took possession of that vineyard and presented it to Ahab. But I think it's safe to say that his happiness was short-lived. And before the end of that tale, we know that Ahab was killed in battle, and Jezebel, if I'm not mistaken, was pitched out a window. And so, and as it said, when Ahab was killed in battle, he was carried back home in his chariot, and he died, and they washed his chariot out by the wall. And the dogs came up and licked the blood as it was washed off of his chariot. And then it was said to Jezebel, the dogs that have lapped up your husband's blood will lap up your blood. And that's exactly what happened, just like it was said. But these were two of the sorriest individuals that ever lived. But they weren't sorry because they lacked for anything other than integrity, and godliness. They had anything really their heart could want or desire. Obviously, Naboth's vineyard was an exception to that, but there were some spiritual reasons behind that. Then you have I'm going to skip Cora. Of course, Cora led the rebellion against Moses and Aaron, and he and his lot were swallowed up by the earth. But I wouldn't put Cora necessarily in the same category as Ahab, just based on what was going on. But Absalom betrayed his own father to be king. And by the way, it took him a long time to do it. I mean, it wasn't like that Absalom just raised up a coup against his father overnight or in the course of a few short days or even weeks. But the Bible says that Absalom sat in the gate of the city and stole the heart of the people. That took a long time. But he schemed and he planned, and of course then he ended up wrenching the throne from his father, and then how things end for him. Well, he ended up hanging by the hair of his head in the boughs of a tree, and Joab put 3 darts in his heart for him. And so it didn't end well for Absalom either. Then you have Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. They lived for themselves, even though they were Christians. They desired the shallow praise of men, and were willing to lie to Peter and lie to God and lie to the church in order to gain just a few brief moments of praise. And it didn't end well for them either. They both died the same day. Struck down by God. And you think about what do the names Ahab and Jezebel and Absalom and Ananias and Sapphira, all those names engendered negative thoughts. We don't think of anything positive with regard to any of those individuals. And then you have in the next paragraph, you think about some of the people that considered giving to be a privilege. It says Abraham gave Lot first choice of pasture lands for their flocks. Remember, Abraham had large flocks and many servants, and Lot was blessed as well because of Abraham, and they couldn't dwell together. And so Abraham said, look all around you. If you go this way, I'll go that. Whichever way you go, I'll go the opposite way. And Lot picked what was obviously the best place to raise cattle, but the worst place to raise children. He pitched his tent towards Sodom. And that didn't end well for Lot. It didn't end well for his wife. It didn't end well for his 2 married daughters. It didn't end well for his 2 unmarried daughters. It didn't end well for him. But what about the story of Abraham? How did things go for Abraham? Man, Abraham lived a long, rich life. How many people can we read of in the scriptures that says he was a friend of God? And so, and by the way, that's not the only account of Abraham being a giver. When there was the 4 kings against the 5 in Genesis 14, and they took Lot and these people captive, and the 4 kings defeated the 5, and Abraham took 317 of his servants, and he went to battle, and he got Lot back, and he got his family back, and he got all the possessions back, and all the possessions of the 5 kings that were taken. And when he came back with it, the king of Sodom said, all I want is the people. In other words, all I want is, I just want our people to come back. You keep all the stuff. And Abraham said, not for 1 second. He gave him back every single thing that he himself had risked to gain. He says, because I don't want you to tell other people that I made you rich. Or that I got rich off of you, is what I should say. That I'm rich because I got your stuff. And he gave every bit of it back to the king of Sodom. And then turned right around and gave 1/10 of all of it to Melchizedek. Gave 1/10 of all of it to Melchizedek, right off the top. And so Abraham was a person who by his very nature was a giver. You think about when he wanted to bury Sarah. And he bought, was it the cave at Machpelah? Is that right?
That's the cave.
Is that right? And that guy said, no. Said, just take it. Just take it. Our relationship, we're too close of friends for me to say this. They said, no, I'm going to buy it. I'm going to buy it. I will surely buy it at a price. What's it worth? He said, look, it's worth 400 shekels, 400 pieces of silver. What is that between you and me? But Abraham measured it out and bought it. And by the way, it probably wasn't nothing to Abraham, and it wasn't nothing to the man that sold him the property. But it shows the spirit of Abraham. Abraham was a giver. Abraham was a sacrificer. An old saying about Abraham says you can follow the path that Abraham took from the smoke of his altars. In other words, everywhere Abraham went, he stopped and offered to the Lord. In other words, you could follow the smoke from his altars if you were following him, or if you were in pursuit of him. So Abraham, a classic case of who considered giving a privilege. Look at Jonathan. He's the next example in there. Jonathan was next in line to be king. Saul was the king, and he was Saul's son, and he was next in line to be king. But Jonathan understood that wasn't God's plan. And he said to David, you will be king, and I will be next to you. Now think about it. A man who was next in line to be king says, no, I'm not going to be king. You're going to be king, and I'll be next to you. In other words, I'll be your right-hand man. I'll help you every way that I can. And even Saul tried to turn Jonathan against David. Said, don't you know as long as David lives, you'll never be king? See, Jonathan had already made up his mind. He'd already set his heart. He had that great spirit within him that he knew that giving was a privilege. Jonathan was not a taker. He was a giver. I hadn't thought about this, but I would have never considered Nehemiah in this group. Nehemiah, but he's right. Brother Johnson's right in this book. He said he gave up a comfortable life in Persia to provide political leadership for the reconstruction of Jerusalem. I would have never considered being a slave in Persia as having a cushy job, but I guess if you were a part of the nation of Israel, that's probably as good a job as you could get. He was the king's cupbearer, and so that would have been a good job to have. And yet he gave it up to take on the aggravation of trying to get the people to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. You think about I may be painting with too broad a brush. If I am, I apologize. But it seems to me that there are far fewer public servants than there used to be. There's a lot of politicians, but very few public servants. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. When I was living in Tennessee back in the early to mid-'90s, right before I came here, there was a gentleman by the name of Bill Frist who ran for the U.S. Senate seat. He was a doctor. He was more than a doctor. He was a heart surgeon. He was one of the top heart surgeons in the state of Tennessee. That guy had a great job, a great career, and a great name, and gave it up. And gave it up to become a U.S. To become a U.S. senator. To me, Rand Paul, Ben Carson. These are all guys that were, doctors. You could have made all the money, basically made all the money they wanted to make in the world, and gave those things up to be, I believe, to be public servants. But how many politicians are really public servants now? But Nehemiah gave up a good job to be a public servant, and took on the headaches that are associated. The headaches that are associated with that time. It reminds me. It wasn't long after I'd moved here in '96. Maybe a handful of years, and I was talking to my cousin, and I was home visiting, and I don't even know why he brought this up, but he said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, if you like it at Burleson, you better stay there. He said, because a bigger church just means a lot more headaches. And he's right. He's right. More people just mean more problems. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just a fact of life. And I took that advice to heart. I've always been happy. And I've never had any desire to go anywhere else. Never even talked to anybody about going anywhere else.
We used to talk about this, kind of brought back memories when you were great. We're over there, we'd ride around.
Beulah said, "Leave her out of that."
We'd ride around. I can ride around and look where I was going. And Martha does this too.
But Martha's not as old as y'all.
No, but I come to houses that fell in, usually you look at houses and stuff, and the people come on. And I think back when he was a Christian. It don't matter to you. Then I get to know he wasn't a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of have an idea for it.
Right. The life that person lived lives on in your mind when you see that old house place. Right. Yeah, that's just natural. That's just a natural. You associate those old places with with the memory of the people that occupied them, and that's a house you could go to if you needed something. Wouldn't matter what time of the day or night, if it's cold or whatever.
But they worked all their life. Some of them just was thinking about you're gonna die. Yeah,
on the wrong side of it, yeah, that's true too. But I loved his inclusion of Nehemiah here as a public servant, because that's what he was, and he took on a. By the way, when you get to the very end of the book of Nehemiah, about four times in that last chapter, which I believe is chapter 13, he says, "Lord, remember." What you talking about? Remember when we did this, or when I did this, and remember when I did this, and remember when I did. And he gets to the end of the chapter and says, "Remember me, O my God, for good." Remember me, O my God, for good. That's the heart of a true public servant. That when I'm done with my role here on this earth, that people will remember me. Remember me for good. The song, "What will I leave behind?" And so I love the inclusion of Nehemiah. At first I scratched my head, and then the more I thought about it, I thought, man, what a great example there. And so you contrast these people with these in this second paragraph, and this contrast is just so stark. Now down at the bottom of page 98. Says, no one admires an indolent, miserly, or gluttonous person. It says, those who are hungry for power or pleasure are pitied for their skewed sense of values. Sometimes we can feel, I can feel sorry for people that are a whole lot more well off than I am. Why? Because there's no happiness in their life. They're takers. They're not givers. They don't understand the principle that Jesus set forth as recorded in Acts 20 and 35. Now I want to go over here to 99 as we start to make our way to the close. The duty of encouragement. Now giving is a privilege, but giving is also a duty. Now it's one that we should fulfill with great joy. For example, worship is a privilege, right? But worship is also a duty, right? But just because it's a duty doesn't make it a drudgery for us when we understand the purpose of it. And the same thing goes with giving. Giving is a privilege, but it's also a duty. But it doesn't become a drudgery just because there's a duty attached to it. He talks about that Christ's life was summarized as one who went about doing good. Acts 10 and verse 38. Ephesians 2 and verse 10 says, we are the workmanship of God, created in Christ unto good works. We're to be ready to every good work. 2 Timothy 2:21. The Christian is to maintain good works. Titus 3 and verse 8. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good to all men, and especially to those who are the household of the faith. Galatians 6 and verse 10. Paul said to Timothy, command those that are rich in this world to be ready to share. To be ready, do good. Be ready to share. And so there's the duty. For example, Luke 12, for unto whom much is given, much will be required. And as a nation and as a people, we have been blessed. Aside from when Israel was in her earliest days and faithful to God, maybe like during the days of Solomon and some of those times, there's never been a nation more blessed than the United States. Not one, not even close. All right. So, but with that blessing comes a great responsibility. We have a duty, to be good stewards of our blessings. And then secondly, on page 99, that this is an eternal investment. We're laying up for ourselves treasures in heaven. Matthew 6 and verses 19 to 21. In other words, the heavenly treasures don't spoil. They can't be stolen. They're in safekeeping. As Paul said, I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day. 2 Peter 1 and verse 12. In other words, everything that we do is committed to God for safekeeping, and nobody can take it out of God's hand. Matthew 10, 40 to 42. Whoever gives a prophet a cup of cold water in my name shall by no means or in no wise lose his reward. And this goes really to some stuff that's later on in this lesson we may not get to, and that is the fact that everything is laid up. Everything is laid up, big or small. You know, that's one thing that my mom really tried to instill in me when I was a kid, was to save money. Save money. And of course had a piggy bank and whatnot, but the one thing she emphasized was this: every of course, now you got to remember something. This is 1970, so you could still buy something with a penny. You can still buy bubble gum for a penny. All right? But every penny counted. Every penny counted. And when I was a youngster, I saved up enough money to buy a savings bond, which was again another investment that I would have to wait and be patient. And so I bought a $50 savings bond. I think I paid like maybe $37 for it, and 5 years later, I knew it'd be 5 years later. So I think I was 8 when I bought it, and I got to cash it in when I was 13. But there was a great sense of pride, to go to that bank and cash that bond in and get that, and get that money. But the point was, every little thing that I contributed was returned with interest. And so giving, the matter of giving, even the small things have to be taken. And what would they say sometimes? No gift, what? Too small. No donation, too small. Give me another example. Tomorrow there's an effort at Freed Harbin, some kind of a challenge day. Have y'all got an email on this week, Stephanie? That if, and I got one from Ralph Gilmore in the education department, that if they can get 150 donations of any size, somebody will donate $25,000 to that program. All right? And apparently there must be 4 programs, because I was listening to David Shannon. David Shannon said, if we get 500 donors on November 7th, 500 individual donors on November 7th, will be matched $100,000. $100,000. And I was reading it, said, if all the donors just gave $1, it still counts. And it shows you that even that small gift can sometimes add up or lead to a greater gift. And so as we think about our giving as an eternal investment, just remember, everything that we do is contributed to that investment. Whether, if we're thinking of money, whether it's a penny or $1 or $100 or $1,000, it's all going into the care of the Lord. And then you have, and of course that's the bottom part, the little acts of kindness that are so important. And I loved what he said at the bottom here on page 99. He says, love cannot be purchased at a department store or a dealer's showroom. In other words, how many, let's just think, for example, how many dads who don't live with their children, how many divorced dads that don't live with their children, don't spend any time through the year with their children, but try to make up for it at Christmas time by buying big gifts. They try to buy big gifts. Obviously we know those things. We know those things don't work. There's no in other words, there's no replacement for what is trying to be replaced. And I love the statement that he made. He said, what people want and need is the time and attention of someone who cares for them. And I thought that was particularly pertinent to parenting. He says, when love is withheld, gifts become empty apologies for a pattern of neglect. In other words, the size of that gift says, I know I stink, but I'm going to buy you this and hope that you'll overlook it until next year. How many times do those things happen in the lives of children when parents are missing? They're AWOL. You cannot buy back those things with those types of gifts. On page 100, again, I want us to think a little bit more about the little things. In the first full paragraph says, talk about if little things can be great things, how much more is that true when God is behind them? You know, we got a song in the songbook. We hardly ever sing it. It's called "Little is Much." What?
Much is in it.
When God is in it. Little is much when God is in it. Now, the example that he uses is Zechariah chapter 4. And says, who has despised the day of small things? Now, let me give you some background as to what's going on here. The children of Israel have returned from 70 years of captivity. The Persians, the Darius or Darius, however you want to say it, the Persian or the Mede, has returned the people back to their homeland. The wall has been rebuilt. The foundation of the temple has been laid. And then the people quit building. They quit building. They quit building the Lord's house, and they started building their own houses instead. And then they built their houses, and they built fine houses for themselves. Now, Zechariah and Haggai are contemporaries. Those two books are written almost at the exact same time. All right? What happened is that when the people started building the temple and rebuilding it, in other words, they laid the foundation and they quit. 16 years later, they got rebuked. They start building the temple again, but they got discouraged. They got discouraged. Why? Because they knew that the temple they were building would never be as glorious as the temple that got destroyed. I mean, Solomon's temple was overlaid inside and out with gold. All the utensils were gold. I mean, that thing must have been an unbelievable... I mean, think about what a gold-covered building must have looked like on top of Jerusalem, on the top of that mountain, you know, in Judea. I mean, that thing must have shone like crazy, right? Now, they're building one that's not going to be overlaid in gold or silver or copper or anything else. It's just going to be a stone building. And the people that were building it were discouraged because they thought what they were building wasn't going to be as good as what they were replacing. But God said, you've missed the mark. He says, I'm going to make this temple more glorious than the one that you're replacing. Not because we're going to overlay it with gold, but because this is the temple where the Redeemer is going to walk. Now think about what that would have done. What would that have done to the mind of the Jew? It would have encouraged him, right? Even though the temple itself wouldn't have appeared as glorious as the former temple, to know that the Redeemer of Israel was going to walk in the temple that I'm building would have caused me to be really diligent to work to finish that temple. And so, you know, the statement was made, who has despised the day of small things? But it really wasn't a small thing after all. They were building the temple that Jesus was going to walk in. And so we think about these small things. Then on page 101 is more about celebrating the small. Let me just close with this thought outside the book. It doesn't take a lot to really make somebody's day. I got up this morning about 4:30, and for some reason, Darrell Payton was on my mind. I love Darrell Payton. And so I got up and I prayed for Darrell and his family. And I sent him a text first thing this morning. I said, I want you to know something. At 4:45, I was praying for you and your family. I love and appreciate you. Darrell sends me a text back. He said, that's the best text I've ever got in my life. Right? But on the other hand, I got a text this week from somebody not only inquiring about my mom, but inquiring about me. Now, how do you think that made me feel? In other words, I was encouraged earlier in the week, and it encouraged me to encourage somebody else. And so we see the beauty The beauty. You leading singing or? What are you doing? Pointing at the phone.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What are you doing, Monkey? What are you doing, Monkey?